Billionaire slaps a pilot mid-air. What the pilot did next was horrible. The moment it happened, the cockpit seemed to shrink. At 37,000 feet, with the aircraft slicing smoothly through a pale blue sky, the slap landed like a gunshot. It wasn't loud in volume, but it was deafening in meaning. A sharp crack of skin against skin, followed by a stunned silence so heavy it pressed against every gauge, every switch, every human heartbeat inside the cockpit. The autopilot hummed on, oblivious. Outside, the clouds drifted peacefully, unaware that something had just gone terribly wrong. For a split second, time fractured. The pilot's head snapped slightly to the side, not from pain, but from shock. His hands froze inches from the controls, fingers hovering as if the air itself had turned solid. The co-pilot sucked in a breath so hard it almost hurt, his eyes darting between the captain and the man standing behind him. No one spoke. No one moved. The cockpit, usually a place of calm authority and disciplined precision, had become a sealed chamber of disbelief. The billionaire stood there, chest rising, jaw tight, his expensive suit immaculate even in outrage. To him, the slap was not violence, it was punctuation. A final, emphatic period at the end of a sentence he believed he had every right to write. Moments earlier, this had been just another flight. The aircraft had departed on schedule, cabin filled with the quiet luxury reserved for the powerful leather seats, hushed conversations, champagne poured with practiced elegance. The billionaire, a man whose name could bend markets and bankrupt rivals with a phone call, had boarded with the casual arrogance of someone who never questioned whether the world would make room for him. It always had. From the start, he'd been dissatisfied. A minor delay on the runway. A seatbelt sign that stayed on too long. Turbulence that dared to inconvenience him. Each irritation stacked on the next, building pressure behind his eyes. When the flight attendant politely explained safety protocol, he waved her off. When the captain announced a weather deviation, he scoffed. In his world, obstacles existed to be removed. Eventually, he demanded to speak directly to the pilot. Regulations were bent. Courtesy was extended. The cockpit door opened. Inside, the pilot had remained composed. He was a man in his early 40s, with thousands of flight hours behind him and a reputation for unshakable calm. He'd guided aircraft through storms that rattled bones and nights so dark the sky seemed bottomless. Responsibility sat naturally on his shoulders, not as a badge, but as a burden he carried willingly. He listened. He explained. He spoke of air traffic congestion, of a storm system forming ahead, of safety margins that could not be negotiated. His voice was steady, respectful, firm. He did not raise it. He did not apologize for physics. The billionaire heard defiance. "What do you mean we're diverting?" He snapped. "Do you have any idea who I am?" The pilot did not flinch. "Sir, this decision is about safety." That word safety felt like an insult. The billionaire stepped closer, invading the narrow space of the cockpit, the smell of expensive cologne clashing with recycled air. He gestured sharply, his frustration spilling over into his hands, his voice rising just enough to be heard over the instruments. "I didn't pay millions to be delayed by excuses," he said. "Fix it." "I can't," the pilot replied evenly, "and I won't." That was when the slap happened. Now in the aftermath, the meaning of that act hung suspended between them. The co-pilot's pulse thundered in his ears. Every rule he'd ever learned screamed that this was wrong, dangerous, catastrophic. Not just because of the violence, but because of where it had occurred. A cockpit was not a boardroom. Authority here was not bought. The billionaire waited. He expected outrage, fear, submission, maybe an apology, carefully worded to preserve pride on both sides. He had seen men crumble for less. Instead, the pilot slowly turned his head back to center. He did not touch his cheek. He did not glare. He did not speak. Something had changed in his eyes. It wasn't anger. It was colder than that, calculated, focused, as if a line had been crossed so decisively that emotion was no longer required. He took a breath deep, controlled, and placed both hands firmly on the controls, recentering himself in the only role that mattered now: captain. The silence stretched, taut as a cable. Behind them, the cabin remained unaware. Passengers sipped drinks, scrolled through phones, slept. Hundreds of lives floated through the sky, trusting that the men in the cockpit would do exactly what they were trained to do. They trusted the system. They trusted the rules. The billionaire straightened his cuffs, his expression settling into smug certainty. Whatever this pilot thought he was doing, this would end the same way everything else did. Power would reassert itself. Consequences would fall upward, not down. He had no idea that the decision forming in the pilot's mind had nothing to do with pride or revenge. It had everything to do with procedure. And procedure, once set in motion at 37,000 feet, was unforgiving. The pilot reached forward and adjusted a dial, not urgently, not dramatically, but deliberately. The co-pilot noticed and felt a chill crawl up his spine. He knew that movement. He knew what it meant. His mouth opened, then closed again. Training held him silent. Outside, the sky remained serene. Inside, the flight had just crossed a point of no return. And this was only the beginning. The first thing the billionaire noticed was not the movement of the pilot's hands. It was the change in the air. Something intangible shifted inside the cockpit, like the pressure before a storm breaks. The confident, confrontational energy he'd brought in with him no longer dominated the space. It was as if the room had quietly, decisively rejected him. The pilot's posture remained upright, professional, but there was now an invisible wall between them, one built not of fear, but of absolute control. The co-pilot swallowed hard. His training told him exactly what protocol demanded when a cockpit was breached, when crew members were assaulted, when safety was compromised. He had rehearsed these scenarios in simulators, discussed them in classrooms, read them in manuals thick as bricks. They were theoretical, abstract. Until now. "Sir," the pilot finally said, his voice calm enough to be unsettling, "you need to return to your seat." The billionaire scoffed, a short dismissive sound. "Or what?" he said. "You'll land the plane? You'll delay me even more?" The pilot didn't answer right away. Instead, he pressed a button on the control panel, his finger firm, precise. A small indicator light flicked on. The co-pilot's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. The cockpit voice recorder. From this moment on, everything was being documented. Every word, every breath. The billionaire didn't realize it, but the balance of power had already begun to tilt. "You think I don't own this airline?" The billionaire continued, stepping closer again. "Do you think people like you say no to people like me and walk away?" The pilot turned his head just enough to meet the man's gaze. There was no challenge in his eyes, only clarity. "Sir," he said, "this aircraft is under my command. Your actions have violated federal aviation regulations." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across the billionaire's face. Just for a heartbeat. Regulations were things other people worried about. Lawyers handled them. Money smoothed them out. But the pilot's tone carried something unfamiliar finality. The co-pilot finally spoke, his voice tight. "Captain, we have a situation." "Yes," the pilot replied. "We do." He adjusted another setting, and the aircraft made a subtle but unmistakable change in course. Nothing dramatic enough for the cabin to feel immediately, but enough that air traffic control would notice. Enough that a record would be created. The billionaire frowned. "What are you doing?" "Diverting," the pilot said simply. The word hit harder than the slap. "You can't do that," the billionaire snapped. "Do you have any idea what this will cost me?" The pilot's eyes returned to the instruments. "I do." In the cabin, a gentle chime sounded. The seatbelt sign illuminated again. A murmur of confusion rippled through the passengers as the captain's voice came over the intercom, steady, measured, reassuring. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to an unforeseen situation, we will be diverting to the nearest suitable airport. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Our crew will assist you." The announcement was met with groans, whispers, annoyance. No one knew the real reason. No one knew that one man's arrogance had set this chain of events in motion. The billionaire's face flushed. "Unforeseen situation?" He repeated, "You're doing this because of me?" The pilot finally turned fully in his seat. "I'm doing this because the safety and integrity of this flight has been compromised." "You're making a mistake," the billionaire said, lowering his voice, trying a different tactic. "A very expensive one." The pilot studied him for a moment, not as a subordinate, not as an employee, but as a risk factor. "You assaulted a flight crew member," he said, "in the cockpit, mid-air." The words sounded heavier spoken aloud. The billionaire opened his mouth to argue, but no justification came that didn't sound absurd even to him. He straightened, scoffing again, though the sound lacked conviction this time. "This won't end well for you," he said. The pilot nodded once. "That's been noted." He turned back to the controls. Silence followed, thick and uncomfortable. The billionaire stood there, suddenly unsure of what to do with himself. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was supposed to leave the cockpit victorious, his will imposed, the world rearranged to suit him. Instead, he felt small. The co-pilot glanced at the captain, searching his face for doubt. There was none. Only focus. Air traffic control crackled through the radio, questioning the deviation. The pilot responded crisply, using precise language, codes, procedures that transformed the situation into something official, unavoidable. The machine of aviation bureaucracy was now in motion, slow, relentless, immune to wealth. The billionaire took a step back, then another. For the first time in his life, power had failed him at 37,000 feet. And the pilot hadn't even raised his voice. As the cockpit door opened to escort him out, the billionaire cast one last look at the man he had slapped, hoping to find anger, fear, anything human to exploit. He found none. What he didn't know was that this diversion was only the surface consequence. What waited on the ground would be far worse. By the time the aircraft began its descent, the billionaire had lost all sense of time. Minutes stretched unnaturally long as he sat rigidly in his first-class seat, hands clenched, jaw tight, eyes fixed on nothing. The cabin buzzed with speculation. Passengers whispered theories, mechanical trouble, medical emergency, weather issues. No one guessed the truth. No one imagined that the man sitting silently by the window, wearing a tailored suit worth more than some houses, was the reason the plane was no longer heading toward its original destination. A flight attendant stopped near his row, her posture polite but guarded. She didn't look at him the way she had earlier, with deference, with a rehearsed smile reserved for powerful clients. Now there was distance. Professional distance. "Sir," she said softly, "please remain seated after landing. Authorities will board the aircraft. Authorities." The word echoed louder than any accusation. He forced a dismissive laugh. "This is unnecessary," he said. "Once they realize who I am, this will all be cleared up." The attendant nodded once, not agreeing, not arguing. "Thank you for your cooperation." Cooperation. Another word he wasn't used to hearing directed at him. As the plane touched down, the tires screamed against the runway. The sound felt accusatory. Final. The billionaire exhaled sharply, realizing only then how shallow his breathing had become. The aircraft taxied to a remote area of the airport, not a gate. That detail unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Moments later, the cabin door opened. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, followed by an airline security representative. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned. Phones were discreetly lowered. "Ladies and gentlemen," the security representative announced, "please remain seated." The officers walked straight toward first class. Straight toward him. The billionaire stood halfway, instinctively trying to regain control. "There must be some misunderstanding," he began, adjusting his jacket. "Sir," one officer interrupted calmly, "please remain seated." That tone again. Calm, firm, unmoved by status. They asked for his identification. He handed it over with forced confidence. The officer studied it, then nodded, not impressed, not surprised. "You are being escorted off the aircraft for questioning regarding an incident that occurred during the flight," the officer said. Passengers watched openly now. No one pretended not to stare. "This is outrageous," the billionaire said loudly, attempting to reclaim the room. "I'll have your jobs for this." The officer didn't react. "Sir, please come with us." There was no dramatic resistance, no shouting, just the quiet humiliation of standing, collecting his things, and walking past rows of people who now saw him not as an untouchable figure, but as a problem. As he stepped onto the tarmac, the cool air hit his face. He paused, glancing back at the aircraft. Somewhere in the cockpit, the pilot was completing paperwork, documenting every second of the encounter with meticulous care. Inside the terminal, the billionaire was led into a private room. Questions followed, structured, procedural, unavoidable. They asked him to recount the events in the cockpit. He minimized, reframed, justified. He spoke of stress, delays, misunderstandings. Then they played the audio. His voice came through the speakers, sharp, condescending, escalating. Then the sound of movement. A sudden noise, silence. The slap. It was unmistakable. The billionaire stared at the table, his earlier bravado evaporating. No lawyer could erase that sound. No donation could reframe it. Hours later, after statements were taken and reports filed, he was released pending further review. No arrest. Not yet. But something far worse lingered. Consequences. By the time he finally reached his destination on a different flight, hours later, the story had already begun to spread. Not publicly. Not yet. But internally. At airline headquarters, senior executives gathered in a glass-walled conference room. Screens displayed reports, transcripts, regulations highlighted in red. The pilot's statement was read aloud, clear, factual, unemotional. "This is a serious breach," one executive said. "Regardless of who he is," another nodded. "If this becomes public." "It might," someone else added quietly. Meanwhile, the pilot sat at home, uniform jacket draped over a chair, hands wrapped around a cooling cup of coffee. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a heavy calm. He replayed the moment again and again, not the slap, but what followed. The choice. He knew he'd done the right thing. He also knew the cost could be high. Powerful people rarely accepted being challenged without retaliation. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Captain," a voice said, measured and professional. "This is the airline's legal department. We need to speak with you." He closed his eyes briefly. "I'm listening." Across the city, in a penthouse overlooking glittering lights, the billionaire stood alone, staring at his reflection in the window. For the first time in decades, he felt something unfamiliar claw at his chest. Fear. Not of punishment, but of exposure. Because he was beginning to realize that this incident would not disappear quietly, and that the man he had struck midair had unknowingly set in motion something that money might not be able to stop. The call the pilot received that night was only the beginning. By morning, the situation had grown far beyond a single incident report. Internal memos circulated at airline headquarters, each one more serious than the last. Legal teams reviewed international aviation laws, passenger conduct regulations, and zero-tolerance policies for interference with flight crew. Every document pointed in the same direction. What happened midair was not a misunderstanding, it was a violation. And violations, regardless of who committed them, demanded action. The pilot arrived at headquarters early, uniform pressed, posture steady. He was escorted into a conference room where senior executives, legal advisors, and safety officers were already waiting. No one smiled. No one offered small talk. "We want to be clear," the airline's chief legal officer began. "You followed protocol." Relief flickered across the pilot's face, but he stayed silent. "You documented the incident, you de-escalated the situation, and you prioritized passenger safety," she continued. "That is exactly what we expect from our captains." A pause followed. "However," another executive added, folding his hands, "the individual involved is influential." The pilot nodded. "I assumed as much. What you may not realize," the executive said carefully, "is that this individual is also a major shareholder in multiple aviation-related businesses. Not ours, but close enough that this could create external pressure." The pilot met his gaze. "With respect," he said evenly, "pressure doesn't change what happened." Silence filled the room. Then, slowly, the CEO of the airline leaned forward. "That," she said, "is exactly why we called you here." She turned a screen toward him. On it was a draft statement, clear, firm, unapologetic. It outlined the incident without naming the individual, reaffirmed the airline's commitment to crew safety, and confirmed that appropriate legal steps were underway. "We're releasing this today," she said. The pilot exhaled, tension draining from his shoulders. "Thank you." At the same moment, across the city, the billionaire's world was tightening. His legal team had been working nonstop, phones ringing, assistants rushing in and out with updates he didn't want to hear. Every attempt to suppress the situation met resistance. The airline refused to stay silent. Aviation authorities requested formal interviews. And worse, someone on the plane had spoken to a journalist. The headline didn't mention his name, yet. Industry titan removed from flight after altercation with pilot. He read it twice, then threw the tablet across the room. "This cannot go public," he snapped. "Do you understand what this would do?" One lawyer adjusted his glasses. "With respect, sir, it already is." The billionaire sank into his chair, anger giving way to something colder. He had always believed rules were flexible, negotiable. That influence could smooth any situation. But aviation law was different. You don't bend rules at 35,000 feet. Days later, the pilot was called to testify before an aviation review board. The process was meticulous. Questions were asked, timelines verified, audio reviewed. Each time, the evidence reinforced the same conclusion. The pilot had acted professionally. The passenger had not. When the board's findings were finalized, the consequences were swift. The billionaire was banned indefinitely from the airline and placed on a watch list pending further investigation. Regulatory fines followed. Corporate partners began distancing themselves quietly, cautiously, but unmistakably. Power, it turned out, was fragile when exposed to daylight. Weeks later, the pilot returned to flying. On his first day back, As he walked through the terminal, something unexpected happened. Passengers applauded, not loudly, not dramatically. Just a ripple of quiet appreciation that followed him down the jet bridge. A few nodded. One elderly woman squeezed his hand and whispered, "Thank you for keeping us safe." He smiled, humbled. Far above the clouds, doing what he loved, he felt lighter than he had in years. Meanwhile, the billionaire stood before a mirror in his penthouse, adjusting a suit he rarely wore anymore. Invitations had slowed. Calls went unanswered. The world hadn't ended, but it had changed. For the first time, he understood something he had ignored all his life. Respect isn't demanded, it's earned. And sometimes it's lost in a single moment midair with nowhere to hide. The story faded from headlines eventually, replaced by newer scandals, louder news. But inside the airline, it became part of training. A case study, a reminder. No matter how high someone flies in life, there are places where everyone is equal. And at 35,000 feet, the cockpit is one of them.